The Great Self-Tape Debate. Hey everyone, I'm Matthew Cornwell with Get Taped here in Atlanta, Georgia, one of Atlanta's original audition taping services, which I co-own with my amazingly talented, beautiful wife and best friend, Brooke. There she is. And now on to our topic. The Great Self-Tape Debate. Okay, I waited a while to tackle this topic, but first let me give you some context. A few weeks ago, before taping this video, things blew up nationally about this topic of self-taping. I'll link some deadline articles in the show notes below, so if you're uninitiated, make sure you spool yourself up at some point. So what I want to do today is bring some perspective to actors to some different sides of the self-taping issue that you might not have been considering. Because honestly, things became a little too West Side Story there for a hot second. Easy action. The initial tempers have calmed down, but I am 10,000% sure those heated opinions still exist. And by tempers, I mean like the comments that were showing up in those deadline articles, on Twitter, Instagram, etc. All painting casting as the enemy. Okay, so let's talk about some of the main points actors bring up about the difference between self-tape auditions and in-person. Because most of the heated opinions are about how unfair self-tape requirements are and how it just sucks to be relegated to taping at home versus how amazing in-persons used to be. One of the first arguments is that prior to self-taping, and side note, that would be before 2012 here in the Southeast. Yeah, we've been doing it that long. Is that actors only had to act when they went to an in-person audition. You show up, you walk into the room, you lay out your performance, and then you leave. With self-tape auditions, I gotta know a little bit about camera, lighting, sound, compression, editing, etc. It's just unfair. Well, actors, do you agree that there's a cost associated with self-taping, specifically at home? You have to buy the equipment, but even if you have the equipment already, there's an intangible cost associated with your time. The time it takes to set up your equipment, the time it takes to actually do the taping, which might involve waiting for your neighbor to stop mowing their yard, and the time it takes to break down, upload, the compression and the editing that happens before that, etc., etc., etc. So if I were to ask you, what's the monetary value you would associate with that lost time? If I were to offer to compensate you $10 for the time it takes you to do a one-line audition, and I'm talking including the setup of your room, the actual recording of it, the maybe asking your roommate or a friend to come over and either hit record or read the lines opposite, whatever. Is $10 enough compensation? Because just so you know, at Get Taped here in Atlanta, $10 is all it'll cost you to tape one of those one-liners. And yes, there is an additional cost of coming to Get Taped, which is gas and the wear and tear on your car. But luckily here in Atlanta, there are taping services in every corner of the city, so you can really mitigate the extra costs associated with driving to and from the taping service. And speaking of commuting, those in-person auditions that you so covet as fond memories, how much time did you spend in the car on the way to that audition? How much time did you spend in the waiting room of that audition? How much time did you spend driving back home, kind of going over how the audition went? And also with those in-persons, you often didn't have a say in when your appointment time was, so you might have had to give up a shift at work. And there's a very real cost associated with losing work. Whereas if you're going to come to a self-taping service like Get Taped, you get to choose your time slot and you can work that around your work schedule. My point is, whether you decide to tape at home, or if you decide to come to Get Taped or some other taping service, the costs between those two, I would argue, are relatively even. And when you compare it to the costs of the in-person experience, having to maybe give up a shift at work, the transportation to and from the audition, maybe those costs are pretty equivalent. Heck, in the Southeast, without self-taping, I'd still be driving 450 miles to Wilmington, North Carolina, or New Orleans, Louisiana, just for an audition. I don't miss that at all. So before you get on your soapbox about the cost of self-taping versus in-person, make sure you actually deconstruct the issue and look at it from all sides. Oh, and to the point of it being unfair that you have to learn something about lighting and sound and camera, etc., well, that actually makes you a better actor. Sorry to burst your bubble on that one. Because spoiler alert, this is a collaborative medium. Go do theater if you want to just act, because theater is an actor's medium. In other words, the burden of having to learn about these other disciplines is actually a blessing in disguise as far as I'm concerned. Now, the counter argument to that would be, Matt, okay, whatever, but when I'm on set, I'm not even allowed to touch that equipment, let alone tell the DP where to put the camera. Fair enough. But when you are on set and you're hearing those discussions happen around you, does it make sense to you, or does it just all sound like everyone's speaking Klingon? I mean, if you actually understood why the DP was changing that lens, or why they're panning that light just a little bit left, or why the boom operator needs 5 minutes to fix your mic, wouldn't that ease your mind a little bit? Make you feel a little more confident on set? Maybe it's just me, but I feel like knowing a little bit about everyone else's job on set is not just respectful, it's necessary. After all, actors are really one of the only disciplines on set that have to interact with almost every other discipline. Now, another big reason actors lament self-tape auditions is that in person, they would have gotten adjustments and feedback in the room. I get it. Hard to argue that, but I'm gonna. During these last few weeks, I've seen some casting directors become very vocal and make some very poignant points about this very topic. There's too many fairies in the same sentence. First, think about this. For every pre-read or first audition that you would go to in person, there is no one else in the room except that casting person, right? If you get a callback, whatever. But even nowadays, if the callback is going to happen, that's likely going to be in person or over Zoom, where you now will get that FaceTime. So I'm talking about these first auditions or pre-reads that they might call them. And that person who you're in the room with doesn't have the power to hire you on the spot. But if they're in love with you, how do they make sure that you're going to get a callback or that you get booked directly? Oh, I know. They have a camera in the room and they record you, and then they show that two-dimensional image to the powers that be. In other words, Matt, are you telling me that it's always been the two-dimensional recorded image that got me booked on the job? Huh. Okay, but Matt, feedback, adjustments, what about that? Okay, glad you asked. A casting friend of mine posted on Facebook about this topic, and essentially, I'll be paraphrasing, which is why I will spare their name in case I sort of get their sentiments a little bit wrong, but that when you would get the adjustment and the second take in the room, it wasn't always because it was really necessary for you or for them. They may be asking for that second take because they can't stop and watch back the first take to really see whether or not you nailed all the nuances. Partially because they're glancing down at their own script so they don't actually clock everything you're doing, but also because they're in it with you in the moment. I mean, I experience this every day I get taped. Actor does the first take and says, "Hey, Matt, what'd you think?" And I literally cannot tell them until I watch it back. I need to see what the camera captured and how the two-dimensional performance compares to that live three-dimensional experience that I had with them, where I was also in the scene. And since casting doesn't have the luxury of playing it back to make sure they did get it, then sometimes they're asking for that second take just as a safety. I realize that it still seems like there's an advantage to in-person auditions when it comes to this, but perhaps the point I'm making is that actors shouldn't covet that feedback, that second take, as much as they currently are. Because time and time again, all throughout this self-tape revolution or evolution, and again for Southeastern actors, this dates back to as far as really 2006 and 7. You hear time and time again at Q&As with casting that it's never about the perfect read or about figuring out what casting wants. It's all about you being an authentic human expressing that part of the human experience that you already do so well, and that you have ownership and control over. And if a casting director has to remind you of that with their quote-unquote feedback or adjustments, well, then you didn't need the casting director. You needed a teacher or coach. Trust me, producers, directors, casting, they respond to actors who are self-sufficient. That is, you walk in or show up on tape with your ideas, your humanity, your signature performance. They are never looking for the desperate actor who just needs a second take with a little bit of an adjustment. Because quite frankly, the director doesn't have time for that type of actor on set. They need the actor who is inherently a collaborator, who will show up on set with their own ideas and will implement those ideas until it starts to deviate from the director's vision, at which point they can step in and course correct. Side note, I'm largely talking about anywhere from one-liners and co-stars up to the guest star level. Once you start getting into those higher roles on the call sheet, of course, there's going to be much more communication and discussion between the actor and the director to ensure that they have a shared vision. I know I've grossly oversimplified the process when making this point, but really what I'm doing is asking you, the actor, to take inventory of why you crave that feedback so much. Because if it's just that you need validation, that's not a good reason. And I'm being very serious here. That's a discussion for a therapist. And if you're worried that the self-tape that you submitted might be 90% perfect, but you just need that little adjustment to slot you over and make it perfect, then trust that if it really does need that small adjustment, casting will reach out to you and ask you to self-tape again with the note. But 9 times out of 10, they know you could make that adjustment, so they don't even bother to reach out to you, and yay, you still book. Having said all that, there is one point that I will concede of why in-person can be better than the self-tape experience. And namely, it's that actors, we need cheerleaders in this business. Your agent arguably should be your biggest cheerleader, and if they're not, well then eventually you'll realize you need a new agent. But in addition to them, you need to cultivate relationships with casting directors so that they can become fans of you. And truthfully, that is much harder to do if you don't get a chance to have face-to-face connection with them. Even worse, if you've never met them in person. Perhaps you just moved to a new market where everything is self-tape, like Atlanta, and you just haven't had a chance to meet any of these casting directors in the flesh. From the actor side, you never, ever, ever get to meet this person and get to know their personality and their quirks and their idiosyncrasies and their sense of humor. But weirdly, they get to know you, albeit at a slower pace if they're only getting to know you through your self-tape submissions. But I do know many actors, myself included, who have booked with casting directors who they've never met in person. Hey, Matthew Sefik. The reason? Well, good work is good work. Like Steve Martin says, be so good they can't ignore you. If you're a well-trained, self-sufficient actor, that will radiate through that two-dimensional image in your self-tape. And yes, you'll develop fans even if you've never met them in the flesh. So maybe I didn't actually concede that point. In all seriousness, I do think that in-person, face-to-face experiences will speed up the cultivation phase of a new relationship with casting. But once it is established, I do think that self-taping can easily maintain that relationship. But it's hard, I know. I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and I got to go slowly through the transition from 100% in-person auditions to 99.9% self-tape auditions here in the Southeast. It can be lonely, and actors crave that interaction because it's part of what we're trained to do on screen. And so we miss it when off screen we don't have a chance to connect with that casting director in person, or even get to run into your friends at an audition that you haven't seen in a bit. So my final point will be this. Despite all the hardships, the real hardships that come with self-taping, does it actually affect your ability to book the job? Look, there are anecdotes out there that will lead you to believe, yes, self-taping is a liability. But overall, on the average, I would submit to you that self-taping should not affect your ability to book and have a long career in this industry. Now, before I wrap this up, I do want to acknowledge that I did not address some of the other complaints that come up from actors about self-taping, like confusing taping instructions, unreasonable requests like 5 or more pages due in less than 24 hours, commercial casting directors essentially requiring you to purchase props for the audition or film on location. That's not cool. There are legitimate concerns in both TV and film and commercial, and some of these have been or will be addressed by SAG-AFTRA in the near future. But we do still have quite a ways to go. So in short, the discussion certainly didn't end here. It's really the start of the many nuances of this topic. I just hope that by taking on some of the biggest complaints that come up from actors regarding self-taping, I've caused you to stop and think a little. And even if you want to still be angry about this topic, maybe don't channel that anger at the casting directors so much. After all, their budgets are set by their producers. So even if it was safe to have in-person auditions, they often couldn't afford it because they don't have it in their budget to rent a space. And the timelines are set by producers. So much of what you're complaining about isn't even the fault of a casting director. They're actually on our side so much more than we give them credit for. Okay, so of the topics I covered, if you have any comments or questions, drop them below. And if there are other aspects of this debate that I didn't cover that maybe you'd want to see in a future video, also let me know. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on set.